In the world of first-class travel, where luxury is expected and entitlement often follows, a single encounter would prove that appearances can be deceiving and assumptions can lead to humiliating consequences. The gleaming interior of Flight 237 from New York to Los Angeles set the stage for what began as a typical journey for the wealthy and privileged, but would end as a lesson in humility that no one aboard would soon forget. Comment where you're watching from today, as we dive into a story that reminds us all about the dangers of judging others too quickly. It was a crisp autumn morning at JFK International Airport when passengers for the transcontinental flight began boarding. First-class passengers were welcomed aboard with practiced smiles and champagne flutes, the gentle hum of the aircraft's systems providing a soothing backdrop to murmured conversations about business deals and vacation properties. Among them walked a young woman in her early 30s, dressed in faded jeans, a simple gray hoodie, and worn sneakers. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and she wore no makeup or jewelry that might hint at wealth or status. She carried only a weathered leather messenger bag as she quietly made her way to seat 2A by the window. The contrast between her understated appearance and the opulence of first class was immediately apparent to everyone who noticed her. Most passengers were too absorbed in their own importance to pay her much mind, but not Maxwell Porter. As a senior investment banker with Hamilton and Brooks, Maxwell had spent years cultivating an image of success. His tailored Armani suit, Rolex watch, and meticulously maintained appearance were badges of honor in his world, symbols of achievement that he believed entitled him to certain privileges, including the right to determine who belonged in his proximity. Maxwell's cold blue eyes narrowed as he watched the young woman settle into the seat across the aisle from his. He took a deliberate sip of his pre-flight champagne, making no effort to hide his scrutiny. He had paid $12,000 for this flight, and in his mind, that purchase included a specific type of experience, one that didn't involve sharing space with someone who looked like they'd wandered in from economy by mistake. "Excuse me," Maxwell called to a passing flight attendant, his voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I believe there might be some confusion with seating arrangements." The flight attendant approached with a professional smile. "Is there a problem, sir?" Maxwell gestured subtly toward the young woman, who was now leafing through a dog-eared paperback. "I'm just wondering if there's been some sort of mix-up. First class seems to be accommodating unexpected guests today." Though he kept his tone light, the implication was clear. The flight attendant's smile tightened almost imperceptibly as she glanced at the young woman's boarding pass, which was visible on the small table beside her. "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Porter. All our passengers are in their assigned seats." Maxwell's lips pressed into a thin line as the flight attendant moved away. The young woman hadn't reacted to the exchange, seemingly absorbed in her book, but several other passengers had noticed. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others pretended not to hear. One elderly gentleman in the row behind frowned disapprovingly at Maxwell, but said nothing. As the remaining passengers boarded and the cabin prepared for departure, Maxwell couldn't let go of his irritation. His carefully curated first-class experience was being diluted by this interloper who clearly didn't belong. When the young woman declined the offer of champagne in favor of water, his suspicions seemed confirmed. "First time in first class?" Maxwell asked loudly as the plane began taxiing, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The young woman looked up from her book, regarding him with calm hazel eyes. "No," she replied simply, before returning to her reading. The brevity of her response only irritated Maxwell further. He was accustomed to people engaging with him, recognizing his status and responding accordingly. Her dismissal was as unfamiliar as it was infuriating. "Let me guess," he persisted. "Company upgrade?" "Lucky day?" Again, the woman looked up, this time with a hint of resignation. "Something like that." "Well, enjoy it while it lasts," Maxwell chuckled, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Some of us are here every week, part of the job when you're handling multi-million-dollar accounts." A few seats ahead, a businessman on his laptop glanced back with a mixture of embarrassment and fascination at Maxwell's display. Nearby, a well-dressed couple exchanged knowing looks, the kind shared between people who recognize uncouth behavior but choose not to intervene. The young woman merely nodded politely and returned to her book, her composure unshaken. This only spurred Maxwell further. There was something about her calm demeanor that seemed to challenge him, though she had hardly spoken a word. As the flight reached cruising altitude and the service began, Maxwell continued his passive-aggressive commentary. When she ordered a simple sparkling water and declined the gourmet meal options in favor of a fruit plate, he scoffed audibly. "The filet mignon is excellent on these flights," he announced to no one in particular. "But I suppose not everyone appreciates fine dining, an acquired taste, like most good things in life." The young woman finally closed her book and turned toward Maxwell. There was no anger in her expression, only a quiet assessment that somehow made him more uncomfortable than any confrontation might have. "I'm sure it is," she replied evenly, "but I prefer lighter meals when flying." Maxwell was about to deliver another cutting remark when the flight attendant approached the young woman with unusual deference. "Ms. Hackman, I apologize for the interruption, but the captain wanted to personally welcome you aboard. He's a great admirer of your father's work and your own contributions. If there's anything at all you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to let us know." A subtle shift rippled through the first-class cabin. Passengers who had been pretending not to notice the exchange now sat up straighter, their attention captured by the name. Even Maxwell paused, his champagne glass halfway to his lips, as realization began to dawn. The young woman, Ms. Hackman, smiled warmly at the flight attendant. "Thank you, that's very kind. Please tell the captain I appreciate the welcome." Maxwell's face had drained of color. He stared at the woman with new eyes, suddenly seeing past the casual clothes and understated demeanor. The resemblance was there in the set of her jaw, the intelligent eyes, the quiet dignity that no designer clothes could ever replicate. He was sitting across from Elizabeth Hackman, acclaimed documentary filmmaker and daughter of Hollywood legend Gene Hackman. The woman he had been condescendingly mocking for the past 30 minutes was not only a first-class passenger by her own right, but a respected artist, whose recent documentary on environmental conservation had won major awards and influenced policy changes across 3 continents. And Maxwell Porter had just spent half an hour trying to make her feel unwelcome in a space where she had every right to be. As this reality sank in, Maxwell became acutely aware of the changed atmosphere in the cabin. Glances that had previously been curious or amused were now tinged with something else, disapproval, even disdain, directed squarely at him. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, and he found himself on unfamiliar ground, the object of judgment rather than the one passing it. The first chapter of our story closes with Maxwell sinking deeper into his seat, suddenly finding his expensive surroundings far less comfortable than they had been just moments before. But the real consequences of his behavior are yet to unfold, as this journey across the continent has only just begun, and Elizabeth Hackman has not yet shown her full hand in response to his rudeness. Chapter 2. The sleek aircraft cut through the clouds at 35,000 feet, the gentle hum of its engines creating a backdrop to the newfound tension in the first-class cabin. Maxwell Porter's earlier smugness had evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of his social misstep. He busied himself with his tablet, pretending to review financial documents while stealing glances at Elizabeth Hackman, who had returned to her book with the same quiet composure she'd maintained throughout his barrage of condescension. The luxurious cabin, with its spacious leather seats and attentive service, suddenly felt stifling to Maxwell. The very amenities he had used to bolster his sense of superiority now seemed to mock him. The flight attendants, who had earlier treated him with professional courtesy, now seemed to linger longer at Elizabeth's seat, their smiles more genuine, their attention more focused. Elizabeth herself seemed unbothered by the revelation of her identity. There was no triumphant smirk, no pointed looks in Maxwell's direction. Her calm indifference somehow made the situation worse. She didn't even consider his behavior important enough to acknowledge, let alone respond to. It was as if he were a minor turbulence in her journey, nothing more. As lunch service concluded, a distinguished older passenger from the row behind leaned forward. "Excuse me, Ms. Hackman," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "I just wanted to say that your documentary on coral reef conservation changed my company's entire approach to sustainable materials. Brilliant work." Elizabeth turned with a warm smile. That's wonderful to hear. The real credit goes to the marine biologists who spent years gathering the data. I just helped tell their story. Too modest, the man replied with a chuckle. My daughter's studying environmental filmmaking because of you. Would you mind if I took a quick photo to send her? She'd be thrilled. Of course, Elizabeth agreed, turning to pose briefly with the man while his seatmate snapped a picture on his phone. Maxwell observed this exchange with growing discomfort. The woman he had dismissed as out of place was being treated with the genuine respect that he had always tried to command through expensive suits and name-dropping. More passengers began to take notice, and soon Elizabeth was engaged in quiet conversation with several of them, each interaction marked by the same unpretentious warmth. A young tech entrepreneur from Force C approached, mentioning that his company had contributed to the conservation fund established after Elizabeth's documentary. A retired professor praised the structural storytelling of her work. A fashion designer complimented the ethical production standards Elizabeth had highlighted in her film about fast fashion. Maxwell sank deeper into his seat, feeling increasingly invisible. The social currency he had assumed was his exclusive right in this rarefied environment was flowing freely around him, but none of it was directed his way. Worse, he caught several disapproving glances from passengers who had witnessed his earlier behavior. The flight attendant who had initially revealed Elizabeth's identity approached Maxwell with the drink service. Her professional demeanor was intact, but the warmth behind it had cooled noticeably. Another champagne, Mr. Porter? She asked, her voice neutral. Just water, thank you, Maxwell replied, his earlier bluster deflated. As she handed him the water, she leaned slightly closer. You know, she said quietly, Ms. Hackman flies with us often, always in first class, always in those same casual clothes. The crew loves her. She knows everyone's names, asks about their families. She straightened up, her point delivered with surgical precision. Maxwell took a long sip of water, wishing it were something stronger. The implicit rebuke stung more than an outright confrontation would have. He glanced at Elizabeth again, trying to reconcile the influential filmmaker with the unassuming woman in the hoodie. The disconnect between his assumptions and reality left him disoriented. Midway through the flight, Elizabeth stood and made her way toward the lavatory at the front of the cabin. As she passed Maxwell's seat, she paused briefly, meeting his eyes for the first time since the revelation of her identity. Enjoying the flight? She asked, her tone neutral, giving him an opportunity to reset their interaction. Maxwell cleared his throat. Yes, thank you. Listen, I should apologize for earlier. I didn't realize that I belonged here. Elizabeth finished for him, her voice still calm but with a new edge of clarity. That's the interesting thing about assumptions, isn't it? They tell us more about the person making them than the person they're made about. Before Maxwell could respond, a flight attendant approached with urgency. Ms. Hackman, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation in economy that I think you might be able to help with. There's a young film student having a panic attack. She's traveling to your father's retrospective in Los Angeles, and the turbulence triggered her anxiety. When she heard you were on board, well, she said meeting you might help calm her down. Elizabeth's attention immediately shifted. Of course, I'd be happy to help. Lead the way. As she turned to follow the flight attendant, she gave Maxwell a final glance. Everyone deserves to feel like they belong, Mr. Porter, even when they don't meet others' expectations of what belonging looks like. With that, she was gone, making her way past the business class divider and into economy, where her presence was met with surprised murmurs and appreciative glances. Maxwell watched as she disappeared from view, the casual confidence of her departure leaving him with thoughts he hadn't entertained in years. The other first-class passengers had observed the brief exchange, adding another layer to Maxwell's discomfort. The elderly gentleman who had frowned at him earlier now shook his head openly in disapproval. A corporate executive type who had been silent throughout the flight caught Maxwell's eye and raised an eyebrow as if to say, "You really stepped in it, didn't you?" As the flight continued over the vast American landscape below, Maxwell found himself in unfamiliar territory, not just 35,000 feet above ground, but far outside his comfort zone of assumed superiority and unearned deference. The remaining hours of the flight stretched before him like a gauntlet he would have to walk, surrounded by people who had witnessed his arrogance and its subsequent deflation. And somewhere behind him, in the crowded economy section that he had never bothered to acknowledge, Elizabeth Hackman was demonstrating what genuine class looked like, not through expensive possessions or assertions of status, but through simple human kindness offered freely to a stranger in distress. The true measure of first class, Maxwell was beginning to realize, had nothing to do with the price of his ticket or the exclusivity of his seat. And as the plane continued its journey westward, this realization settled around him like an uncomfortable truth that could no longer be ignored. Time seemed to stretch endlessly for Maxwell as he sat alone with his thoughts in the first-class cabin. The ambient sounds of the aircraft, the gentle hum of engines, the occasional clink of glassware, the muted conversations, all faded into the background as he replayed his interactions with Elizabeth Hackman. Each remembered word, each dismissive glance he had cast her way, now returned to him with painful clarity. 40 minutes had passed since Elizabeth had gone to economy class to help the anxious film student. In her absence, Maxwell had become acutely aware of how the other passengers were treating him. Where before they might have engaged him in conversation about business or travel, now they seemed to deliberately avoid his gaze. The invisible but unmistakable bubble of isolation around him was new and deeply unsettling for a man who had built his entire identity on social recognition. When Elizabeth finally returned to the first-class cabin, she was accompanied by a flight attendant who was thanking her profusely. Maxwell watched surreptitiously over the edge of the financial magazine he had been pretending to read. "Really, it was no trouble," Elizabeth was saying. "Jasmine just needed someone to talk through her breathing exercises with her. She's doing much better now." "You spent almost an hour with her," the flight attendant said. "Most celebrities wouldn't give a minute." Elizabeth shook her head, a small frown creasing her brow. "I'm not a celebrity. My father is the famous one. I just make documentaries about things that matter." As Elizabeth returned to her seat, Maxwell noticed something different about the way she carried herself. There was a thoughtfulness in her expression that hadn't been there before, a distant look in her eyes that suggested her mind was elsewhere. She pulled out a small notebook from her messenger bag and began to write, completely absorbed in whatever thoughts the encounter in economy had sparked. Maxwell's curiosity overcame his embarrassment. He had built a successful career partly on his ability to read people, to identify opportunities and advantages in human interaction. Despite his earlier missteps, that instinct remained. "Was everything all right back there?" he asked, keeping his voice low and respectful. Elizabeth looked up, mild surprise registering on her face at his initiation of conversation. She seemed to consider for a moment whether to engage or dismiss him. "Yes," she finally replied. "A young film student having a panic attack. She's on her way to the retrospective of my father's work at UCLA Film School." That's thoughtful of you to help," Maxwell said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Genuine compliments without agenda were not his typical currency. Elizabeth studied him for a moment. It wasn't thoughtfulness, it was basic human decency. The words weren't delivered harshly, but as a simple statement of fact. Maxwell nodded, accepting the implicit rebuke. "I deserve that." "This isn't about what you deserve, Mr. Porter," Elizabeth said, closing her notebook. "It's about understanding that your measure of a person's worth says more about you than it does about them." A flight attendant approached with the afternoon snack service, momentarily pausing their conversation. Maxwell declined the offered cheese plate, while Elizabeth accepted a simple cup of herbal tea. When they were alone again, Maxwell tried a different approach. "Your father's retrospective. Is that why you're traveling to Los Angeles?" Elizabeth nodded. "Partly. I'm also meeting with potential investors for my next project. A documentary about wealth disparity in America and its impact on social mobility." The irony was not lost on Maxwell. Here he was, the embodiment of privilege, speaking to a filmmaker documenting its darker consequences. "Sounds controversial," he offered. "Truth often is," Elizabeth replied. "The girl in economy, Jasmine, she's the first in her family to attend college. Brilliant filmmaker with more raw talent than most professionals I know. She's worked 3 jobs to afford this trip to my father's retrospective, hoping to make connections that might give her a foothold in an industry that's notoriously difficult to enter without connections or family wealth. Maxwell shifted uncomfortably. And you're going to help her? I'm going to introduce her to people who can recognize talent regardless of its packaging, Elizabeth said pointedly, something not everyone has the capacity to do. The conversation was interrupted when the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they would be experiencing some turbulence and requesting that passengers return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. As if on cue, the plane gave a slight shudder. Elizabeth calmly secured her seatbelt while Maxwell gripped his armrests. He had never been comfortable with turbulence, though he usually masked his anxiety with forced nonchalance. Not a fan of rough air? Elizabeth asked, noticing his white-knuckled grip. Just being cautious, Maxwell replied stiffly. The plane jolted again, more forcefully this time. A few gasps came from around the cabin. Elizabeth remained perfectly composed, returning to her notebook as if they were sitting in a quiet cafe rather than a shaking aircraft. How are you so calm? Maxwell asked, unable to hide his discomfort as the plane continued to bounce through the rough air. Elizabeth looked up. Perspective, Mr. Porter. I've filmed in war zones and natural disaster areas. I've interviewed people who have lost everything and still found reasons to smile. A little turbulence seems rather minor in comparison. Her words hung in the air between them as the plane continued to navigate the rough skies. Maxwell found himself thinking about the people Elizabeth had mentioned, those who had lost everything, yet maintained their dignity and humanity. How different they must be from him, who had everything yet had behaved with such petty disdain towards someone simply because of her appearance. As the turbulence gradually subsided, a strange calm settled over Maxwell. It wasn't just the smoothing of their flight path, but something within him, a subtle shift in perspective. I've never thought about it that way, he admitted. Most people with privilege don't have to, Elizabeth replied, not unkindly. That's what privilege is. The luxury of not having to consider certain realities. Before Maxwell could respond, his phone chimed with an incoming email. Force of habit made him check it immediately. His face paled as he read the message. Problem? Elizabeth asked, noticing his reaction. Maxwell looked up, genuine distress evident in his expression. My presentation files for tomorrow's client meeting are corrupted. My assistant was supposed to send backups, but they're not attached. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disrupting it for the first time since boarding. This account is worth millions to our firm. Elizabeth observed him thoughtfully. What kind of presentation? Investment portfolio proposal for a major corporate client, Maxwell said, distracted as he typed a frantic response to his assistant. Visual data is everything in these pitches. Without the graphics, it's just numbers on a page. To his surprise, Elizabeth reached into her messenger bag and pulled out a sleek laptop. I might be able to help. Before documentaries, I worked in corporate communications. Visual data presentation was my specialty. Maxwell blinked in surprise. You'd help me? After how I treated you? Elizabeth smiled, the first genuine smile she had directed at him. Contrary to what you might believe, Mr. Porter, most people don't base their willingness to help others on social status or first impressions. As the flight continued toward Los Angeles, Maxwell found himself in the unexpected position of collaborating with the very woman he had dismissed hours earlier. Elizabeth's expertise in visual presentation was impressive, her ability to transform complex data into compelling graphics, both efficient and artful. What had begun as one of the most humiliating experiences of Maxwell's professional life was transforming into something entirely different. A lesson in humility, perspective, and the true meaning of class that went far beyond the confines of their first-class cabin. The airplane continued its journey westward, cutting through the afternoon sky as the first-class cabin settled into a strange, new dynamic. Maxwell sat with his laptop open, frantically scrolling through emails, desperately trying to salvage his corrupted presentation files. His perfectly composed facade had cracked, revealing genuine distress beneath the polished exterior. Across the aisle, Elizabeth observed his mounting panic with thoughtful consideration. Server issues, she finally asked, breaking the silence between them. Maxwell glanced up, surprised by her willingness to engage after their earlier exchanges. corrupted files. My assistant was supposed to send backups, but the attachments are missing." His voice lacked its earlier condescension, replaced by the authentic stress of a professional facing potential failure. "I have a presentation for Westridge Global tomorrow morning. Without these visuals, I'm—" He trailed off, unwilling to admit just how vulnerable his position had become. Elizabeth nodded, understanding the gravity of his situation. "Data visualization is crucial for investment pitches. I remember from my early career days." Maxwell's eyebrows rose slightly. "You worked in finance?" "Corporate communications for 3 years before I moved into documentary filmmaking," Elizabeth explained. "Helped executives translate complex data into compelling visual stories." She paused, seeming to weigh a decision. "I might be able to help if you'd like." The offer hung between them, a gesture of kindness that Maxwell knew he hadn't earned. His pride battled briefly with pragmatism before necessity won out. "I would appreciate any assistance," he managed, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. Elizabeth retrieved her laptop from the messenger bag that Maxwell had earlier dismissed as too casual for first class. As she opened it, he caught a glimpse of high-end video editing software and several folders labeled with project names he recognized from award-winning documentaries. "Let me see what you're working with," she said, moving to the empty seat beside him. For the next hour, Maxwell watched in growing amazement as Elizabeth transformed his dense spreadsheets and text-heavy slides into visually compelling representations of the same data. Her fingers moved deftly across the keyboard, her decisions confident and purposeful. "The human brain processes visual information much faster than text," she explained as she worked. "Your original slides buried the narrative under too many numbers. The story you're trying to tell should be immediately apparent." "Where did you learn to do this?" Maxwell asked, genuinely impressed. "Film school teaches you to communicate complex ideas through visual hierarchy," Elizabeth replied. "Whether it's a documentary about climate change or a corporate presentation about investment opportunities, the principles are the same: clarity, impact, and emotional resonance." As they worked together, the earlier tension between them gradually transformed into a focused collaboration. Maxwell found himself explaining the nuances of his investment strategy, while Elizabeth translated his expertise into compelling visuals. The exchange was unexpectedly balanced, his financial knowledge complemented by her communication skills. "Your father must be proud of your success," Maxwell ventured during a brief pause in their work. Elizabeth smiled slightly. "Dad has always valued authenticity over accolades. He's more proud that I make films about issues that matter than of any award I've won." "Is that why you don't—" Maxwell hesitated, gesturing vaguely at her casual attire. "Flaunt my background?" Elizabeth finished for him. "I grew up watching my father navigate fame. He taught me that true respect comes from who you are, not what you own or who people think you are." She gave him a pointed look. "Status symbols are just that. Symbols. They don't define the person." Maxwell absorbed this, feeling the gentle rebuke in her words. Before he could respond, a flight attendant approached their seats. "Ms. Hackman, I apologize for the interruption, but there's a situation in economy class that I thought you might be able to help with." The attendant's voice was low, professional, but tinged with concern. "There's a young film student traveling to your father's retrospective who's having a severe anxiety attack. When she heard you were on board, she asked if it might be possible to meet you." Elizabeth immediately saved their work and stood. "Of course, lead the way." "But we're in the middle of—" Maxwell began, gesturing to the presentation. Elizabeth's response was gentle but firm. "Some things take priority, Mr. Porter. We're making good progress, but this young woman needs help now. The presentation can wait 15 minutes. As Elizabeth followed the flight attendant toward economy class, Maxwell found himself alone with his thoughts. He watched other first-class passengers, tracking Elizabeth's departure with approving nods and glances. The elderly gentleman who had frowned at Maxwell earlier caught his eye and gave a small nod of what seemed like approval at Maxwell's collaboration with Elizabeth. 15 minutes stretched to 30, then 45. Maxwell alternated between reviewing their progress on the presentation and glancing toward the economy curtain, wondering what was happening beyond it. The more time passed, the more he realized that Elizabeth's willingness to help him, a man who had treated her with disdain, was not an isolated act of kindness, but a reflection of who she fundamentally was. When Elizabeth finally returned, there was a thoughtful expression on her face. Without explanation, she resumed her seat beside Maxwell and reopened the laptop. "Everything okay?" Maxwell asked, surprising himself with his genuine concern. Elizabeth nodded. "Jasmine will be fine. She's brilliantly talented, but comes from a background with limited opportunities. This trip to my father's retrospective represents everything to her, her first chance to make industry connections that might give her a foothold in filmmaking." And the anxiety attack? Fear of failure, imposter syndrome, the usual demons that haunt talented people who haven't had the advantage of believing they belong in exclusive spaces. Elizabeth gave him a meaningful look. "Some of us never have to question whether we'll be accepted in first class, Mr. Porter. Others spend their entire lives fighting to prove they deserve a seat at the table." The words landed with precision, neither accusatory nor harsh, but illuminating in their truth. Maxwell felt something shift inside him, a perspective tilting just enough to reveal a view he'd never before considered. "I think I understand," he said quietly. Elizabeth studied him for a moment, as if assessing the authenticity of his response. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she turned back to the presentation with renewed focus. "Now, about this risk assessment slide," she said, returning to their work. "You're burying the most compelling data point. Let's restructure this to lead with your strongest argument." As they continued collaborating, the dynamics between them evolved further. Maxwell found himself deferring to Elizabeth's expertise without the internal resistance he usually felt when yielding control. There was something liberating in acknowledging someone else's mastery, in learning rather than performing the role of the person who already knew everything. The captain's announcement of upcoming turbulence briefly interrupted their work. As the plane began to shudder and bounce through rough air, Maxwell instinctively gripped his armrest, his knuckles whitening with each jolt of the aircraft. Elizabeth noticed his discomfort but made no comment, continuing to work on the presentation as if they were sitting in a stable office rather than a shaking airplane. Her calm demeanor somehow made Maxwell even more aware of his own tension. "Not a fan of turbulence?" she finally asked, her tone free of judgment. "Just being cautious," Maxwell replied stiffly, attempting to maintain his composure. "It's okay to be afraid," Elizabeth said simply. "Fear doesn't diminish strength. It's how we respond to it that matters." As the plane continued to buck and sway through the disturbed air, Maxwell found himself wondering if they were still talking about turbulence at all, or if Elizabeth Hackman was offering him another lesson, one about vulnerability, authenticity, and the courage to acknowledge one's own limitations. Either way, as the first-class cabin made its way through the rough skies toward Los Angeles, Maxwell Porter was beginning to understand that this journey was taking him to places far more significant than his westbound destination. Places within himself that he hadn't explored in years, if ever, regions of self-awareness that would make the remaining hours of this flight unlike any he had experienced before. The turbulence gradually subsided, the aircraft finding smoother air as it continued its westward journey. Maxwell unclenched his fingers from the armrest, trying to appear nonchalant about his obvious discomfort during the rough patch. Elizabeth had returned to her original seat across the aisle, leaving him with a nearly completed presentation that exceeded anything his team had produced in weeks of work. "You should be all set," she said, gesturing to his laptop. "I've saved everything to your drive and created a backup on a cloud server just in case. The access information is in the text file on your desktop." Maxwell nodded gratefully. "This is remarkable work. I don't know how to thank you properly." "No thanks necessary," Elizabeth replied. "Just pay it forward sometime." Their conversation paused as the lead flight attendant approached. "Ms. Hackman, the captain would like to speak with you when you have a moment. He's a great admirer of your Antarctica documentary." Elizabeth smiled. "Of course. I'll come up in a few minutes." As the flight attendant moved away, Maxwell found himself curious about this woman whose identity had completely upended his assumptions. Antarctica? That sounds intense. It was, Elizabeth confirmed, a flash of passion illuminating her features. "We were documenting the effects of climate change on the ice shelves, spent 3 months in conditions that tested every limit. But the footage we captured. She shook her head slightly, as if still in awe of the experience. Some things are worth the discomfort. I saw that documentary, came a voice from across the aisle. A middle-aged woman in a business suit leaned forward. The sequence showing the ice bridge collapse was extraordinary. How did you get that shot? Elizabeth turned to engage with the woman, explaining technical details about camera positioning and the team's calculated risk-taking to capture the perfect moment. Soon, other passengers joined the conversation, drawn by Elizabeth's unassuming expertise and genuine passion for her craft. Maxwell observed the interaction with growing fascination. The first-class cabin, typically a collection of isolated individuals working or sleeping behind invisible barriers of privilege, had transformed into something resembling a community. Elizabeth fielded questions about her work with the same attentiveness, whether they came from the CEO in 3A or the flight attendant pausing during her service routine. Even more striking was how Elizabeth consistently redirected credit to her team members, highlighting the cinematographer's innovation, the sound engineer's persistence, the local guide's invaluable knowledge. Her humility wasn't performative, it was fundamental to her character. The contrast with his own typical behavior wasn't lost on Maxwell. How often had he claimed full credit for his team's successes? How frequently had he dismissed contributions from those he deemed beneath his station? The realization was uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. As the impromptu discussion about documentary filmmaking continued around him, Maxwell found himself drawn into a conversation with the elderly gentleman who had earlier disapproved of his behavior. "Remarkable woman," the man commented quietly, nodding toward Elizabeth. "Reminds me of her father in the best ways." "You know Gene Hackman?" Maxwell asked, surprised. The man smiled. "Worked with him on 2 films in the 80s. I was a production designer. He was the rare star who learned everyone's name, from the lead actress to the craft services staff." He gave Maxwell a knowing look. "Success reveals character, young man. It doesn't create it." Before Maxwell could respond, the flight attendant returned to inform Elizabeth that the captain was available if she wanted to visit the cockpit. Elizabeth excused herself from the group conversation and made her way toward the front of the plane. In her absence, Maxwell found himself approached by the young tech entrepreneur who had earlier mentioned contributing to Elizabeth's conservation fund. "Porter from Hamilton and Brooks, right?" the young man asked, taking the seat Elizabeth had vacated. Maxwell nodded, automatically straightening his tie in preparation for a business conversation, a habit so ingrained he didn't even notice doing it. "Tyler Chen, Horizon Ventures," the entrepreneur introduced himself. "I've seen your firm's presentations at a few conferences, solid investment strategies, but your ESG portfolio is lagging the market. Environmental, social, and governance investments, not Maxwell's specialty, and not where he saw the highest returns. We maintain a balanced approach to risk and social responsibility," he replied automatically. Chen raised an eyebrow. "That's corporate speak for, we don't prioritize it." His tone wasn't accusatory, merely matter of fact. "You know, Elizabeth's work in documentary film has influenced more corporate environmental policies than most regulatory agencies. Her expose on microplastic pollution changed our entire company's approach to packaging." Maxwell found himself genuinely curious. How so? "She didn't just show the problem. Anyone can do that. She documented solutions that were economically viable while being environmentally responsible." Chen leaned forward, enthusiasm evident in his expression. 3 months after her documentary aired, 17 major corporations changed their packaging protocols. Not because they suddenly grew environmental consciences, but because she made the business case alongside the moral one. This perspective on Elizabeth's work, not just as artistic expression but as a catalyst for practical change, shifted Maxwell's understanding yet again. He had mentally categorized her as an idealistic filmmaker, perhaps naively pursuing social causes at the expense of business realities. The idea that her work actually changed corporate behavior on a practical level challenged that assumption. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the economy section, raised voices, and what sounded like someone in distress. Several first-class passengers looked up in concern as a flight attendant hurried past. Elizabeth, returning from the cockpit, paused at the disturbance. After a brief exchange with another crew member, she immediately changed course and headed back toward economy without hesitation. "What's happening?" Maxwell asked the flight attendant who was refreshing his water. "Medical situation," she replied quietly. "A passenger is having some difficulty. The crew is handling it." But as minutes ticked by with continued sounds of distress from beyond the curtain, Maxwell found himself growing concerned. Without fully understanding his own motivation, he rose from his seat and made his way toward economy. What he found there challenged his worldview more profoundly than anything else that had occurred during the flight. Elizabeth was kneeling in the aisle beside an elderly woman who was clearly in respiratory distress. The young film student, Jasmine, was holding the woman's hand while Elizabeth spoke calmly to her, coaching her breathing while simultaneously assembling what appeared to be a makeshift apparatus from an oxygen mask and other components from the plane's emergency kit. "The emergency inhalers aren't helping enough," a flight attendant was explaining anxiously. "Her personal medication is in her checked baggage, and we're still 3 hours from landing." "I need more space and better light," Elizabeth said decisively, looking around the crowded economy cabin. Her eyes landed on Maxwell standing at the curtain. Without hesitation, she called to him. "Mr. Porter, we need to bring Mrs. Chen to first class where there's more room to treat her properly. Can you help clear a space?" Maxwell found himself nodding without hesitation. "Of course." As he turned to head back to first class, he heard Jasmine ask Elizabeth, "Do you have medical training?" Elizabeth's response floated after him. "When you film in remote locations without access to hospitals, you learn what you need to know to keep your crew alive." Maxwell moved quickly, already rearranging the mental map of first class to identify which area would provide the most space and privacy for the medical situation. As he prepared to welcome an economy passenger into the exclusive domain he had earlier tried to protect from intrusion, he realized that Elizabeth Hackman was teaching him far more than just how to design an effective presentation. The transformation of first-class cabin 3B into a makeshift medical station happened with remarkable efficiency. Maxwell worked alongside the flight attendants, clearing an area where 2 seats reclined fully and creating a small but functional space. When Elizabeth emerged from economy supporting the elderly Mrs. Chen with Jasmine's help, several first-class passengers immediately offered assistance. Mrs. Chen was settled into the cleared space, her breathing labored but somewhat stabilized. She appeared to be in her 70s, her slight frame nearly lost in the oversized first-class seat. The contrast between her simple attire and the luxury surroundings was stark, yet no one seemed to notice or care. A remarkable shift from the atmosphere that had prevailed when Elizabeth first took her seat hours earlier. "Thank you," Elizabeth said to Maxwell as she knelt beside Mrs. Chen, adjusting the makeshift breathing apparatus she had assembled. "Can you ask if any passengers have medical training? And see if someone could get us more ice packs from the galley?" Maxwell nodded and moved through the cabin, relaying the requests. A cardiologist from 5C came forward immediately, while the tech entrepreneur Tyler Chen, no relation to the patient, volunteered his thermal water bottle as an additional cold compress. The elderly gentleman who had worked with Gene Hackman offered his cashmere sweater as an extra pillow. As Maxwell coordinated these efforts, he caught glimpses of Elizabeth's focused care. She spoke softly to Mrs. Chen in what sounded like fluent Mandarin, her hands steady as she monitored the woman's pulse and helped position the oxygen mask. Jasmine remained close by, translating when necessary and providing calm reassurance. "She's having an acute asthma attack, compounded by the cabin pressure," the cardiologist explained quietly to Maxwell after examining the patient. "Elizabeth's modifications to the oxygen delivery are helping. She seems to know what she's doing." "She mentioned filming in remote locations," Maxwell replied. "Apparently, medical training was part of the job." The doctor nodded approvingly. "She's doing everything correctly. If we can keep Mrs. Chen stable for the next 3 hours, she should be fine until we land and get proper medical assistance." As the immediate crisis subsided into watchful monitoring, Maxwell found himself standing at the periphery of the activity, observing the communal effort with a strange sense of disconnection from his earlier self. The man who had boarded this flight in New York, obsessed with status and appearances, immediately dismissive of Elizabeth based solely on her casual attire, seemed like a stranger to him now. Elizabeth caught his eye and motioned him over. Mr. Porter, would you mind sitting with Mrs. Chen for a few minutes? I need to speak with the captain about expediting medical assistance when we land. Of course, Maxwell replied, surprised by the request. Just talk to her normally, Elizabeth instructed. Her English is limited but understanding. It helps keep her calm if someone's with her. Maxwell carefully took the seat beside Mrs. Chen, feeling strangely vulnerable. He was accustomed to commanding rooms with financial projections and investment strategies, not providing comfort to strangers in distress. For a moment, he sat awkwardly, unsure how to proceed. Mrs. Chen looked at him with tired eyes above the oxygen mask, her expression questioning. Hello, Mrs. Chen, Maxwell began hesitantly. I'm Maxwell. You're doing very well. The doctor says you'll be fine until we land. She nodded slightly, her eyes remaining on his face. I'm an investment banker, he continued, falling back on familiar territory. I live in New York. I'm traveling to Los Angeles for a business meeting tomorrow. Mrs. Chen's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, suggesting a smile behind her mask. She slowly raised her hand and patted his arm, as if to reassure him rather than the other way around. The simple gesture of human connection, this woman offering comfort despite her own distress, touched something in Maxwell that had been dormant for too long. A memory surfaced suddenly. His grandmother during his childhood, offering the same gentle pat when he was anxious about school presentations. My grandmother had asthma too, he found himself saying, the words emerging without calculation. She taught me that slow, steady breathing helps, in through the nose, out through the mouth. He demonstrated, and Mrs. Chen followed his example. They sat together, breathing in synchronized rhythm, a banker in a $3,000 suit and an elderly woman from economy class finding common ground in the simple act of drawing breath. When Elizabeth returned, she paused at the sight, a small smile playing at her lips. You're a natural, she commented, resuming her position beside Mrs. Chen. Hardly, Maxwell replied, but thank you for trusting me to help. Sometimes people just need an opportunity to show who they really are, Elizabeth said, her focus returning to her patient. Jasmine approached with fresh ice packs from the galley. The captain says we're getting priority landing clearance at LAX, she informed them, and there will be medical personnel meeting the plane. Excellent, Elizabeth nodded. Mrs. Chen, did you hear that? We'll have you feeling better very soon. As the situation stabilized, Maxwell found himself drawn into conversation with Jasmine. The young film student's initial wariness of him, no doubt influenced by her friendship with Elizabeth, gradually gave way to cautious engagement. So you're studying film? Maxwell asked, genuinely interested in a way that surprised him. Documentary filmmaking specifically, Jasmine confirmed. I want to follow in Ms. Hackman's footsteps, using visual storytelling to drive social change. She glanced toward Elizabeth with undisguised admiration. Her work on water access in developing nations literally changed international policy. I didn't realize, Maxwell admitted. I knew she was a filmmaker, but I didn't understand the impact of her work. Jasmine's expression suggested she found this difficult to believe. Her films have influenced corporate sustainability policies, international aid distribution, and climate change legislation. She could be making millions directing commercial features, but she chooses projects that matter instead. The conversation was interrupted when Mrs. Chen experienced another moment of respiratory distress. Elizabeth and the doctor responded immediately, adjusting her oxygen and medication. Maxwell found himself holding his breath until the elderly woman's breathing stabilized again. She reminds me of my mother, Jasmine said quietly. Worked her whole life as a seamstress in Chinatown, raised 4 kids on her own, never complained. Mrs. Chen was traveling to her grandson's college graduation, first in their family to get a degree. The personal details transformed Mrs. Chen from an anonymous patient to a human being with a story, a life filled with sacrifice and pride. Maxwell thought of how easily he had dismissed people like her, how rarely he considered the lives and journeys of those outside his socioeconomic circle. Is your mother coming to the retrospective too? He asked Jasmine. The young woman shook her head. She couldn't take the time off work. This trip took everything I had, 3 jobs and a small scholarship from my school. She smiled slightly. Worth every penny to meet Elizabeth Hackman, though, I never expected she'd be so approachable, Maxwell suggested. Real, Jasmine corrected. Some successful people, they create this barrier between themselves and everyone else, like they're a different species or something. Maxwell felt the comment like a gentle rebuke, recognizing himself in the description. How many barriers had he deliberately constructed to separate himself from those he considered beneath his station? The flight attendant approached with an update from the cockpit. We're beginning our descent into Los Angeles in about 20 minutes. Medical services are standing by at the gate. Elizabeth nodded gratefully. Mrs. Chen is stable, but we'll need to maintain the oxygen until we land. As preparations for descent began around them, Maxwell found himself reflecting on the unlikely community that had formed in first class during this crisis. People who might never have spoken to each other under normal circumstances were now working together, sharing resources and concern for a woman most of them had never met before today. Elizabeth caught his eye across the cabin and gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Not quite approval, but recognition of his participation in something larger than himself. For Maxwell Porter, who had measured his worth in dollars and status for so long, that simple human acknowledgement felt strangely more valuable than any financial transaction he had ever negotiated. As the California coastline appeared below them, Maxwell realized that his journey had become something entirely unexpected, not just a flight from New York to Los Angeles, but a passage from one version of himself to another that he was only beginning to discover. The descent into Los Angeles proceeded with unusual efficiency, the aircraft given priority clearance due to the medical situation on board. Through the windows, the sprawling cityscape emerged from beneath a thin layer of haze, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grid of streets and buildings. The first-class cabin had transformed into something unrecognizable from its earlier state, no longer a collection of isolated travelers protected by invisible walls of privilege, but a makeshift community united by shared purpose. Mrs. Chen's condition remained stable, but precarious. The cardiologist continued to monitor her vital signs, while Elizabeth maintained the improvised oxygen delivery system. Maxwell found himself serving as an impromptu assistant, fetching items as needed and helping keep the surrounding area clear. The roles and status that had seemed so important hours earlier had dissolved in the face of a human being in distress. Beginning final approach to Los Angeles International Airport, the captain announced. Flight attendants, prepare for landing. We'll need to secure Mrs. Chen for landing, Elizabeth said, looking up at Maxwell and Jasmine. Can you both help position her more upright? The doctor says it will help her breathing during descent. Together they carefully adjusted Mrs. Chen's position, ensuring that she was both secure for landing and positioned optimally for respiratory function. The elderly woman's eyes conveyed gratitude that transcended language barriers. You're doing wonderfully, Mrs. Chen, Elizabeth assured her in Mandarin, then switched to English for the others. The paramedics will take over as soon as we land. They'll have proper medication and equipment. The aircraft touched down with a gentle bump, the reverse thrust of the engines pushing passengers forward against their seatbelts. As they taxied toward the gate, the lead flight attendant approached. Medical personnel are waiting at the jetway, she informed them. They'll board first, before other passengers deplane. Elizabeth nodded gratefully. Thank you for coordinating everything so efficiently. It's the least we could do, the flight attendant replied, a note of admiration in her voice. The way you handled this situation was remarkable, Ms. Hackman. Elizabeth shook her head slightly. It was a team effort. Everyone contributed. As the aircraft came to a stop at the gate, a subtle shift occurred in the cabin atmosphere. The immediate crisis was ending, which meant normal routines would soon resume. Maxwell could sense the invisible barriers beginning to re-establish themselves. First-class passengers gathering their expensive belongings, checking their watches, returning to the identities they had temporarily set aside. Yet something had changed. There were exchanges of business cards, genuine handshakes, conversations about staying in touch. The elderly gentleman who had worked with Gene Hackman was deep in conversation with Jasmine about film history. Tyler Chen was discussing sustainable investment opportunities with a fashion executive who had been moved by Mrs. Chen's situation. The sound of the aircraft door opening drew everyone's attention. 2 paramedics boarded efficiently, medical bags in hand, moving directly to where Mrs. Chen was seated. Severe asthma attack complicated by cabin pressure, Elizabeth explained to them, shifting seamlessly into a concise medical report. We've maintained oxygen supplementation and used the aircraft's emergency inhalers, but her response has been limited. She's been stable for the past hour, but requires immediate continuation of treatment. The lead paramedic nodded, impressed. Perfect handoff. We'll take it from here. As they transferred Mrs. Chen to a portable wheelchair specially designed for aircraft evacuation, she reached out and grasped Elizabeth's hand, speaking softly in Mandarin. Elizabeth responded warmly, squeezing the elderly woman's hand before releasing it to the care of the medical professionals. "What did she say?" Maxwell asked as they watched the paramedics carefully maneuver Mrs. Chen toward the exit. "She said that angels come in unexpected forms," Elizabeth translated, a touch of emotion in her voice, "and that her grandson will hear about the kindness she was shown today." The paramedics paused at the exit, allowing Mrs. Chen a moment to turn and bow her head slightly toward the first-class cabin, a gesture of gratitude to all who had helped. Several passengers, including Maxwell, instinctively returned the bow. As Mrs. Chen was escorted from the aircraft, the captain announced that regular deplaning could now commence. The spell that had bound the cabin together began to dissolve as passengers returned to their travel routines, collecting luggage and checking phones that had been ignored during the crisis. "You should go ahead," Elizabeth said to Maxwell, noticing his glance at his watch. "I'm sure you have appointments waiting." Maxwell hesitated. The presentation meeting that had seemed so crucially important that morning now felt strangely distant. "Actually, I'd like to make sure Mrs. Chen gets to the medical center safely. My driver can take a detour." Elizabeth studied him with subtle surprise. "That's thoughtful of you, but not necessary. Her family has been notified and will meet her at the hospital." "Still," Maxwell persisted, surprising himself with his own insistence, "I'd like to see this through." A slight smile touched Elizabeth's lips. "In that case, we can share a ride. I was planning to check on her myself before heading to my father's event." They gathered their belongings and moved toward the exit, allowing other first-class passengers to deplane ahead of them. Jasmine hovered nearby, clearly reluctant to return to economy class and the normal separation it entailed. "Will you be at the retrospective tonight?" Elizabeth asked her. Jasmine nodded eagerly. "Front row. I wouldn't miss it for anything." "Find me afterward," Elizabeth said. "There are some people I'd like you to meet, filmmakers who might be interested in your perspective." The young woman's eyes widened. "Really? That would be... I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary," Elizabeth replied. "Just make films that matter." She glanced at Maxwell. "And remember that allies can come from unexpected places." As they made their way through the terminal, Maxwell noticed how differently Elizabeth moved through the world compared to himself, where he typically strode purposefully, focused on his destination with minimal awareness of his surroundings. She navigated with a present awareness, acknowledging service workers with eye contact, pausing briefly when an elderly traveler needed space, expressing genuine thanks to the gate agents as they passed. These were small courtesies, tiny moments of human recognition that required minimal effort yet clearly made an impact. Maxwell found himself unconsciously mirroring her behavior, slowing his pace and noticing the people around him in a way he rarely had before. Outside the terminal, a driver held a sign with Hackman printed on it. Nearby, Maxwell spotted his own arranged car service, the driver standing at attention beside a black luxury sedan. "My father always sends a car," Elizabeth explained with a small shrug. "Old habits from his Hollywood days, I suppose. We can take this one to check on Mrs. Chen if you're still interested." "Absolutely," Maxwell confirmed, then turned to his waiting driver. "There's been a change of plans. I'll contact you later about tomorrow's pickup." As they settled into Elizabeth's more modest vehicle, Maxwell found himself in unfamiliar territory in more ways than one. The physical journey from New York to Los Angeles had been completed, but the internal journey that had begun when he first mockingly questioned Elizabeth's presence in first class was clearly still unfolding. "The hospital isn't far," Elizabeth said as the driver pulled away from the curb. "And then I need to change before my father's retrospective." She glanced at Maxwell, a question in her expression. "Unless you have other commitments this evening?" Maxwell thought about his original plans. a dinner reservation at an exclusive restaurant where he would dine alone before reviewing his presentation one final time. The prospect suddenly seemed hollow compared to what Elizabeth was offering, a continuation of this unexpected day's journey. "No commitments," he replied. "I'd be honored to attend the retrospective, if the invitation is still open." Elizabeth's smile was genuine. "It is, though I should warn you. My father values authenticity above all else. He has a gift for seeing through pretense." "In that case," Maxwell said, a new certainty in his voice, "I look forward to meeting him as myself. The real one, not the carefully constructed version I boarded the plane with this morning." As their car merged into the Los Angeles traffic, the setting sun painted the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, a fitting backdrop for what had become a day of unexpected revelations and new beginnings. The evening light faded into dusk as the car wound its way through Los Angeles traffic towards Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Maxwell gazed out the window, observing the city with new eyes. The transition from New York's vertical intensity to LA's sprawling horizontality mirrored his own internal shift, from narrow ambition to broader awareness. "Will your father be at the hospital?" Maxwell asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Elizabeth shook her head. "Dad's at the venue making sure everything's set up properly. Despite being the guest of honor, he insisted on checking every detail himself." A fond smile crossed her face. "He's always been hands-on that way. Never believed in standing back while others did the work." The car pulled up to the emergency entrance of the medical center, where they were directed to a waiting area. After a brief consultation with the front desk, a doctor approached them. "Ms. Hackman, I'm Dr. Rivera. I understand you're inquiring about Mrs. Chen?" "Yes," Elizabeth confirmed. "We were on the same flight. She experienced a severe asthma attack." The doctor nodded. "Mrs. Chen is responding well to treatment. We've stabilized her breathing and administered proper medication. Her family arrived about 20 minutes ago." "That's wonderful news," Elizabeth said with genuine relief. "Would it be possible to see her briefly?" "Of course. She's been asking about the angel from the airplane." Dr. Rivera smiled. "I assume that's you?" Elizabeth shook her head slightly. "It was a team effort. This is Maxwell Porter," she added, gesturing to him. "He was instrumental in helping create space for her treatment." Maxwell felt a strange warmth at the acknowledgement, different from the professional recognition he typically craved. This satisfaction came not from status or financial success, but from simply having been useful in a human crisis. They were led to a treatment room where Mrs. Chen rested on a hospital bed, her breathing noticeably improved. A middle-aged man and woman stood beside her, along with a young man in graduation attire, clearly coming directly from his ceremony. When Mrs. Chen spotted Elizabeth and Maxwell, her face brightened. "My airplane angels," she said in accented English, extending her hands toward them. Elizabeth approached, taking the offered hand. "Mrs. Chen, I'm so happy to see you looking better." The elderly woman turned to her family. "These are the people I told you about. They saved my life." The young man in graduation robes stepped forward. "I'm Kevin Chen, Mrs. Chen's grandson. Thank you both so much for helping my grandmother." His voice caught slightly. "Today was supposed to be just about my achievement, but now it's about so much more." "Your grandmother was incredibly brave," Elizabeth replied. "And congratulations on your graduation. What's your degree?" "Environmental science and policy," Kevin answered. "Actually, I cited your documentary on water conservation in my senior thesis." Elizabeth looked genuinely touched. "That's the greatest compliment my work could receive." Maxwell observed this exchange with fascination. The coincidences that connected these strangers, a documentary influencing a student's work, that student's grandmother experiencing a medical emergency on Elizabeth's flight, seemed to speak to something beyond mere chance. In his data-driven world, Maxwell rarely contemplated the invisible threads that might connect seemingly random human experiences. Mrs. Chen's son stepped forward. "We cannot thank you enough," the doctor said without proper intervention on the plane. He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. "Anyone would have done the same," Elizabeth insisted. "No," Mrs. Chen said firmly from her bed. Not anyone. Many would look away. You looked toward. The simple wisdom in her words resonated deeply with Maxwell. How often had he looked away from human need, focused solely on his own advancement? The realization was uncomfortable but necessary. Their visit was necessarily brief, as Mrs. Chen needed rest, and they had the retrospective to attend. As they prepared to leave, Kevin Chen approached Maxwell. "Mr. Porter, my grandmother mentioned you're in finance?" "Investment banking," Maxwell confirmed. "Hamilton and Brooks in New York." Kevin handed him a business card. "I'm starting at the California Environmental Initiative next month. We're always looking for financial partnerships on sustainable development projects. Perhaps we could connect sometime?" A week ago, Maxwell would have politely accepted the card while mentally dismissing the possibility of any beneficial connection. The projects Kevin described typically offered lower returns than the high-profit ventures his firm pursued. But now, he found himself genuinely considering the possibility. "I'd like that," he said, offering his own card in return. "Call my direct line when you're settled in your new position." As they said their goodbyes and returned to the waiting car, Elizabeth gave Maxwell an appraising look. "That was a genuine offer to Kevin, wasn't it?" "Yes," Maxwell admitted, surprising himself with his sincerity. "His generation is focusing on problems mine has mostly ignored. Maybe there's a way to bridge those worlds." The car merged back into traffic, heading toward Beverly Hills, where Elizabeth needed to change before the retrospective. The sun had fully set now, the city transformed into a constellation of lights stretching to the horizon. "We'll stop at my place first," Elizabeth explained. "You can wait while I change, or there's a good coffee shop nearby if you prefer." "I'm fine either way," Maxwell replied, feeling strangely comfortable with the uncertainty of the evening ahead, a notable departure from his usual insistence on rigid schedules and predetermined outcomes. Elizabeth's place turned out to be a modest but elegant craftsman home on a quiet street, not the mansion or luxury condo Maxwell might have expected from someone with her family connections. As they walked up the path, he noticed the carefully tended native plant garden, solar panels on the roof, and a distinctly lived-in quality that spoke of a home rather than a showpiece. "It's not what most people expect," Elizabeth commented, noting his observation. "Dad believed in living within reasonable needs, not excessive wants. It's a principle I've tried to maintain." Inside, the home revealed Elizabeth's true character more clearly than any conversation could have. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on filmmaking, environmental science, philosophy, and literature. Awards for her documentaries were displayed alongside family photos and artifacts from her global travels, not as status symbols, but as memories of meaningful experiences. "Make yourself comfortable," she said, gesturing to the living room. "I'll only be 15 minutes. Left alone, Maxwell wandered the space, studying the photographs that chronicled Elizabeth's life and career. There were images of her as a child with her famous father, shots of her with film crews in remote locations, pictures with indigenous communities and environmental activists. One photo caught his attention particularly, Elizabeth standing beside her father at what appeared to be a homeless shelter, both of them serving food with no cameras or publicity present. The date stamp indicated it was from just 3 months ago. A framed quote on her desk provided further insight into the philosophy that guided her. "Use your privilege to dismantle the systems that created it." Below it, in handwritten script, "Remember why we tell stories, Lizzie. Not for acclaim, but for change. Dad." Maxwell found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth. Elizabeth Hackman, whom he had initially dismissed based on her casual appearance, possessed a wealth he had never considered, a richness of purpose, authentic relationships, and meaningful impact on the world. As he heard her footsteps returning, Maxwell turned to find Elizabeth transformed, not into the Hollywood glamour he might have expected, but into an elegant simplicity that honored the evening's significance while remaining true to her understated style. She wore a well-cut black pantsuit with a single piece of distinctive jewelry, what looked like a handcrafted pendant from one of the communities featured in her documentaries. "Ready?" she asked, picking up a small clutch purse. "Ready," Maxwell confirmed, realizing he meant it in ways that extended far beyond this evening's event. The UCLA Film School's historic theater glowed with subdued elegance, transformed for the evening's retrospective honoring Gene Hackman's cinematic legacy. As their car approached the venue, Maxwell observed the scene with interest. Unlike typical Hollywood premieres with their ostentatious red carpets and paparazzi gauntlets, this event had a more dignified atmosphere, focused on artistic appreciation rather than spectacle. A modest gathering of photographers was present, primarily from film publications and academic press rather than tabloids. Faculty members in formal attire mingled with film students whose excitement was palpable even from a distance. Industry veterans arrived in small groups, their conversations animated as they reunited to celebrate a colleague's body of work. "This will be relatively low-key," Elizabeth explained as their driver pulled up to the entrance. "Dad insisted on keeping it about the films and the students, not the celebrity aspect." Maxwell nodded, adjusting his perception once again. In his world, success was meant to be displayed, achievements broadcast at maximum volume. The deliberate understatement of this event, honoring one of Hollywood's most respected actors, challenged his understanding of what true recognition looked like. As they exited the car, Elizabeth was immediately greeted by several people: film school professors, former colleagues, young filmmakers who approached her with the reverent enthusiasm of students meeting a mentor. Maxwell observed how she navigated these interactions with genuine warmth and focused attention, never glancing over someone's shoulder for a more important conversation, never rushing an exchange to move on to someone more influential. "Elizabeth!" A distinguished-looking man with silver hair embraced her warmly. "Your father's inside, making everyone laugh with stories from the French Connection. Some things never change." "Professor Abrams?" Elizabeth replied with evident affection. "I'd like you to meet Maxwell Porter. Maxwell, this is James Abrams, my graduate school advisor and the curator of tonight's retrospective." The professor extended his hand with a welcoming smile. "Any friend of Elizabeth's is welcome here. Are you in the industry, Mr. Porter?" "Investment banking," Maxwell replied, preparing for the subtle disinterest that typically followed this revelation in artistic circles. To his surprise, Professor Abrams engaged immediately. "Fascinating. We've been developing a curriculum on film financing and sustainable production models. Perhaps you'd be willing to speak to our business of film class sometime." Before Maxwell could formulate a response to this unexpected request, a murmur rippled through the gathering. He turned to see what had captured everyone's attention. Gene Hackman stood in the theater doorway, his commanding presence unmistakable despite his casual stance. At 94, the legendary actor retained the powerful charisma and observant gaze that had defined his most memorable roles. He wore a simple but impeccably tailored dark suit with no tie, his silver hair neatly trimmed, his posture straight and confident. What struck Maxwell most was the absolute authenticity in his demeanor. Unlike many celebrities who perform their public personas, Hackman simply was. Comfortable in his skin, uninterested in proving his importance to anyone. "Dad!" Elizabeth called, moving toward him with a warm smile. Gene Hackman's face transformed at the sight of his daughter, years seeming to fall away as his eyes crinkled with genuine delight. He opened his arms for a hug that spoke volumes about their relationship, mutual respect layered with deep affection. "You made it," he said, his distinctive voice just as resonant as Maxwell remembered from countless films. "Was beginning to think you'd decided to skip your old man's glorification ceremony." Elizabeth laughed. "Never. We had an unexpected detour, medical emergency on the flight, then a hospital visit to check on the patient." Gene nodded knowingly. "Always finding people who need help, Lizzie. Some things never change." His perceptive gaze shifted to Maxwell, standing a respectful distance away. "And who's this?" Elizabeth beckoned Maxwell forward. "Dad, this is Maxwell Porter. We met on the flight from New York. Maxwell, my father, Gene Hackman." Maxwell extended his hand, unexpectedly nervous in the presence of the Hollywood legend. "It's an honor to meet you, sir. Your work has been extraordinary." Gene Hackman's handshake was firm, his assessment direct as he studied Maxwell with the observant intensity that had made his screen performances so compelling. "Thank you. Always nice to meet Elizabeth's friends." There was a subtle emphasis on the word friends that suggested he was reserving judgment until he knew more. "Maxwell helped during the medical emergency," Elizabeth added. "He was quite resourceful." Something in Jean's expression shifted, a barely perceptible softening. That's so. Well then, you're doubly welcome tonight. A young staff member approached discreetly. Mr. Hackman, we're ready to begin whenever you are. Jean nodded. Duty calls. Find good seats, you two. Elizabeth, I expect honest critique afterward, no daughter of the legend politeness. He turned to Maxwell with a hint of mischief in his eyes. She's my toughest critic, you know. Keeps me humble. As Jean moved back into the theater, greeting attendees with relaxed grace, Elizabeth led Maxwell toward the entrance. Fair warning. Dad will probably interrogate you later. He's protective, and he can read people like no one else. I look forward to it, Maxwell replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. Inside, the theater hummed with anticipation. The retrospective would feature selected scenes from Hackman's most significant films, interspersed with commentary from film scholars and colleagues. As they found their seats in the reserved section near the front, Maxwell noticed Jasmine already seated in the front row, practically vibrating with excitement. Elizabeth waved to her, then leaned toward Maxwell. I've arranged for Jasmine to join the small reception afterward. She doesn't know yet. Thought it might be a nice surprise. The thoughtfulness of this gesture, creating an opportunity for a young student without connections or advantages, struck Maxwell deeply. This was privilege used correctly, not as a wall to exclude others, but as a door to welcome them in. As the lights dimmed and the UCLA Film School dean approached the podium to introduce the evening's program, Maxwell found himself in a state of unusual receptivity. The competitive, status-conscious mindset that normally dominated his consciousness had receded, replaced by genuine curiosity and presence. The program began with a montage of Hackman's early roles, his breakthrough in Bonnie and Clyde, the Oscar-winning portrayal of Popeye Doyle in The French Connection, his nuanced performance in The Conversation. The clips were interspersed with commentary from directors and film historians contextualizing his contributions to cinema. Maxwell found himself captivated not just by the performances themselves, but by what they revealed about the man. Throughout his career, Hackman had consistently chosen substance over stardom, complexity over easy charm. He had portrayed flawed, sometimes unlikable characters with unflinching honesty, never softening their rough edges to protect his image. Between segments, Maxwell observed Elizabeth's reactions, her concentrated attention, the occasional smile of recognition or nod of appreciation. This wasn't just her father's work she was watching. It was a legacy of artistic integrity that had clearly shaped her own approach to filmmaking. When clips from The Royal Tenenbaums appeared on screen, Hackman's portrayal of the deeply flawed but ultimately redeemed Royal, Maxwell felt Elizabeth tense slightly beside him. The scene showed Royal attempting to reconnect with the family he had abandoned, his vulnerability revealed beneath layers of bravado and charm. Dad says this role was the closest to playing himself, Elizabeth whispered, the fear of failing the people who matter most. The simple confidence with which she shared this intimate detail, trusting Maxwell with a glimpse into her family's private understanding, felt like a gift he hadn't earned, but desperately wanted to deserve. As the formal presentation concluded and the house lights rose for intermission, Maxwell realized that something fundamental had shifted within him. Throughout his career, he had defined success through external markers, money, power, recognition. Yet here was a man in Gene Hackman who had achieved the rarest form of success, authentic respect not for his status, but for the integrity of his work and character. And beside Maxwell sat Elizabeth, who carried that legacy forward not through entitlement, but through purpose and genuine compassion. As they rose to join the intermission gathering, Maxwell understood that this evening was offering him more than just a glimpse into Hollywood history. It was providing a new template for what a meaningful life might actually look like. The reception following Gene Hackman's retrospective was held in an elegant courtyard adjacent to the theater. String lights hung between mature olive trees, casting a warm glow over the gathering of film industry veterans, academics, and selected students. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, providing a refined backdrop to the animated conversations that flowed between clusters of guests. Maxwell stood near a stone fountain at the courtyard's center, nursing a glass of champagne as he observed the interactions around him. Elizabeth moved through the space with natural ease, connecting people with thoughtful introductions, her genuine interest in others creating bridges between diverse attendees. She had brought Jasmine into a conversation with an influential documentary producer, the young student's initial nervousness gradually yielding to passionate articulation of her creative vision. "She's good at that," came a resonant voice beside him. "Always has been." Maxwell turned to find Gene Hackman standing at his elbow, his own glass containing what appeared to be sparkling water rather than champagne. Despite his years, the actor moved with the quiet precision that had characterized many of his performances, appearing exactly where he intended without announcing his approach. "Mr. Hackman," Maxwell acknowledged, instinctively straightening his posture. "Gene, please," the actor corrected, his observant eyes studying Maxwell with undisguised curiosity. "So, Elizabeth tells me you two had quite an adventure at 35,000 feet. There was something about Gene Hackman's direct gaze that discouraged anything but complete honesty. Maxwell found himself responding with uncharacteristic candor. "The adventure was mostly my education," he admitted. "I made assumptions about your daughter based on her appearance. She proved me wrong in ways I needed to learn." Gene's expression softened with appreciation for Maxwell's frankness. Most people would have tried to rewrite that story with themselves as the hero. He nodded toward Elizabeth across the courtyard. "She has that effect on people, sees past the surface to what they could be, rather than getting stuck on what they are." "She mentioned you taught her that," Maxwell offered. Gene laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Give me too much credit. Elizabeth came into this world with a compass already pointing true north. I just tried not to mess it up too badly." He took a sip of his water, his eyes never leaving Maxwell's face. "What do you do when you're not having epiphanies on airplanes, Mr. Porter?" "Investment banking," Maxwell replied. "Though after today, I'm questioning aspects of how I've approached it." "Questioning is good," Gene nodded approvingly. "The day we stop questioning is the day we stop growing." He gestured toward a quiet corner of the courtyard. "Walk with me a minute?" They moved away from the main gathering, finding a more private space beneath the branches of an ancient olive tree. Gene settled onto a stone bench, indicating for Maxwell to join him. "I was almost 50 when Elizabeth was born," the actor said without preamble. "Had already made most of the mistakes a man can make, prioritized career over relationships, chased validation through achievement, measured my worth by my bank account." His eyes took on a distant quality, looking back through decades. Then this tiny human arrives, and suddenly the emperor's new clothes drop away. You realize what actually matters. Maxwell listened intently, sensing the gift in this unsolicited sharing of wisdom. "I couldn't undo my past," Gene continued, "but I could offer her a different example going forward. Tried to show her that true success isn't about what you accumulate or achieve. It's about what you contribute." He fixed Maxwell with a penetrating look. "You strike me as someone standing at a crossroads, young man. Am I wrong?" "No," Maxwell admitted, the single word containing volumes of recognition. "You're not wrong." Gene nodded, satisfied with the confirmation. "Let me offer you something then for what it's worth. I've known men who died wealthy and alone, and I've known those who died without a dollar, but surrounded by love and genuine mourning. Never once seen anyone wish on their deathbed they'd spent more time at the office." The simplicity of this truth, delivered without judgment or sermon, landed with profound impact. Maxwell thought of his own life in New York, the empty luxury apartment he rarely saw in daylight, relationships maintained primarily for their strategic value, achievements that brought momentary satisfaction but no lasting fulfillment. "Elizabeth mentioned you're working on a presentation about investment opportunities," Gene said, shifting topics with the timing of a skilled performer. "May I ask what kind?" Maxwell described his upcoming meeting with Westridge Global, explaining the portfolio he would be presenting. As he spoke, he found himself naturally emphasizing the long-term stability aspects rather than the aggressive growth components that normally dominated his pitches. Gene listened thoughtfully. "You know," he said when Maxwell finished, "I've always believed that money, like talent, comes with responsibility, not just to grow it, but to direct it towards something meaningful." He gestured toward the gathering. Many of these independent filmmakers struggle to find funding for important projects because the return isn't measured in quarterly profits. Elizabeth mentioned something similar, Maxwell replied, about her next documentary on wealth disparity. Jean's eyes brightened. That project has the potential to shift public discourse in meaningful ways, but securing funding has been challenging. Maxwell found himself considering possibilities that would have seemed professionally heretical just 24 hours earlier. Perhaps I could review her proposal, he suggested. There are alternative funding structures that might align private investment with social impact goals. The conversation was interrupted as Elizabeth approached, accompanied by a distinguished older woman Maxwell recognized as a legendary film editor. "Dad, Marion wants to discuss the French Connection restoration project," Elizabeth said, then noticed the intensity of their conversation. "Should I come back later?" "Not at all," Jean replied, rising from the bench with fluid grace that belied his years. "Mr. Porter and I were just discussing the intersection of finance and filmmaking." He extended his hand to Maxwell. "I hope we'll continue this conversation another time." As Jean moved away with the film editor, Elizabeth took his place on the bench. "Was Dad grilling you?" she asked with a knowing smile. "More like offering perspective," Maxwell replied. "He's quite remarkable." "He is," Elizabeth agreed, her expression soft with affection. "Though don't tell him I said so. He works hard at staying humble." She studied Maxwell's face. "You seem different than you did this morning in first class." Maxwell considered this. "I feel different, like I've been looking at the world through a particular lens for so long that I forgot it was just one way of seeing things." Elizabeth nodded understanding. Perspective shifts can be jarring, but necessary. She hesitated, then added, "I hope it wasn't too uncomfortable." "The most valuable lessons usually are," Maxwell replied with newfound certainty. The reception was winding down, guests beginning to depart with warm handshakes and promises to stay in touch. Jasmine approached, her face alight with excitement. "Ms. Hackman, I can't thank you enough," she said breathlessly. "Mr. Scorsetti wants to see my documentary sample. He said he might have an internship opening next month." Elizabeth smiled warmly. "That's wonderful, Jasmine. Your talent deserves recognition." She turned to Maxwell. "Martin Scorsetti funds an independent documentary initiative. He has an eye for emerging voices." After Jasmine departed with effusive thanks, Elizabeth checked her watch. "It's getting late. I should find my father before he gets cornered by the film theory professors again." "Of course," Maxwell nodded, suddenly aware that the extraordinary day was drawing to its conclusion. "I should call for a car back to my hotel." Elizabeth seemed to consider something before speaking. "Actually, there's a breakfast meeting tomorrow at the Westwood Cafe. Documentary filmmakers and potential investors discussing sustainable funding models. 8 a.m. She met his eyes directly. "You might find it interesting if you're free before your Westridge meeting." The invitation hung between them, not just to a breakfast, but to a continued exploration of the path that had opened unexpectedly before him today. "I'll be there," Maxwell replied without hesitation. As they moved back toward the main gathering to say their goodbyes, Maxwell caught sight of his reflection in a decorative mirror. The man looking back at him wore the same expensive suit he had boarded the plane in that morning, the same carefully styled hair and outward markers of success. But behind his eyes was something entirely new, a questioning, a humility, a potential for growth that hadn't existed before. The journey that had begun in first class had not ended with the plane's landing. It continued into this evening of film and conversation and would extend into tomorrow's breakfast and beyond. Maxwell Porter had arrived in Los Angeles physically, but he was still traveling internally, moving gradually toward a version of himself that Elizabeth Hackman had somehow recognized as possible from the moment they met. As he caught her eye across the courtyard, her knowing smile suggested she saw and approved of this evolution. In that moment, Maxwell understood that some journeys cannot be measured in miles or marked on maps. The most important distances we travel are measured in perspective, in understanding, and in the courage to question our most fundamental assumptions about what truly gives life its first-class value.